What Russia is doing right now in Ukraine should concern every single American who thinks this war is just a distant problem on the other side of the world, because what's being tested on Ukrainian soil today is not staying there. The weapons, the tactics, the strategic logic, it's all being quietly catalogued by every major military power on earth, including the ones that don't exactly wish America well. And the story of these FAB-500 glide bombs, these so-called mini FABs, is one of the most important and under-discussed military developments of our time. Most people have no idea what's actually happening. They hear glide bomb and they think it's just another weapon story, but it isn't. It's a story about how one country, under enormous economic and military pressure from the entire Western world, built an entirely new paradigm of warfare. Cheap, scalable, lethal, and nearly impossible to stop at volume. That should make every American ask a very serious question. Are we prepared for a world where our air defense systems, our logistics bases, our forward deployed troops in Europe face the same kind of saturation these weapons are producing right now in Ukraine? Because the answer, if you look honestly at the numbers, is deeply uncomfortable. And the conversation that Washington should be having, urgently, openly, and without the usual political theater, isn't happening. Not really, not the way it needs to. So let's have it here. Let's talk about what these weapons actually are, what they actually do, how Russia built an industrial system to produce them at scale that has stunned Western analysts, and what all of this means for America's strategic position in a world that is shifting faster than most people realize. The FAB-500 is, in its basic form, a Soviet-era general-purpose bomb, a heavy, blunt instrument of destruction that dates back decades. It weighs roughly 500 kilograms, carries around 200 kilograms of high explosives, and in its original form, it was about as sophisticated as dropping a rock off a tall building. In March 2023, Russian Su-35s launched a number of FAB-500 M62 bombs, wreckage of which indicated they had been fitted with a glide kit involving pop-out wings, giving Russian aircraft a standoff ability to hit Ukrainian targets without risking exposure to Ukrainian air defenses. That was the moment everything changed. That was the moment Russia's engineers took what was essentially a Cold War relic and turned it into one of the most strategically consequential weapons in active use anywhere on Earth today. And they did it not with cutting-edge microchips, not with exotic materials, not with the kind of industrial sophistication that America traditionally assumes gives it an overwhelming advantage. They did it with bolt-on wings, a satellite guidance module, and a production philosophy that prioritized volume over perfection. The system is called the UMPK, Universal Gliding and Correction Module, and understanding what it does is essential to understanding why this matters to you, sitting here in America, watching from what you might think is a safe distance. The UMPK is essentially a cruder analog of the American Joint Direct Attack Munitions Extended Range Variant, or JDAM-ER. Due to Russia's failure to destroy most of Ukraine's air defenses early in the war, venturing near the front line to drop free-fall bombs soon became prohibitively risky, so Moscow hurriedly introduced the UMPK in 2023, allowing the Russian Air Force to play a greater role in supporting ground operations. Think about what that means. Russia faced a problem. Its planes couldn't safely get close enough to drop unguided bombs, and within a remarkably short period of time, Russian industry solved that problem cheaply and at scale. That is a very different story from the one Western analysts were telling just a few years ago, when the consensus view was that Russia's defense industrial base was ossified, corrupt, and incapable of meaningful adaptation under pressure. That consensus was wrong, and when a consensus that shapes American defense planning turns out to be wrong, the consequences don't stay abstract for long. Now let's talk about the numbers, because the numbers are where this story really becomes uncomfortable. In the week from October 6 to 12, Russia used 360 glide bombs. In the run-up to the latest negotiations with US President Trump, Russia dropped a record 268 glide bombs in a single day on October 17th. 109 attacks were flown in the process. Read that again. 1,360 glide bombs in a single week. 268 in a single day. That is not a weapons story. That is an industrial story. That is a story about a country that, despite years of sanctions designed specifically to cripple its military production, figured out how to manufacture precision-guided munitions at a rate that has left NATO officials quietly alarmed. A senior Ukrainian intelligence officer stated that Russia intends to manufacture up to 120,000 glide bombs in 2025, including both newly built weapons and older bombs upgraded with kits. 120,000 in a single year. That is the kind of number that changes strategic calculations, not just on the Ukrainian front, but across every theater where American forces might one day find themselves. And the costs? This is the part that should genuinely unsettle anyone who understands how Western defense procurement works. Public estimates place the unit cost of a UMPK kit at approximately $20,000 compared to about $36,000 for a JDAM ER. This cost differential helps account for the reported expansion of Russian production from roughly 40,000 units in 2024 to a projected 70,000 in 2025. $20,000 per weapon. Now compare that to the cost of the interceptor missiles that air defense systems use to shoot these things down. A single Patriot interceptor costs somewhere between $1 and $4 million. A single Iris-T missile runs even higher. You do that math and you arrive at what military analysts call the cost imposition dilemma, the idea that an adversary can bankrupt your defensive capacity simply by forcing you to spend far more money shooting things down than it costs to launch them. Russia's widespread use of glide bombs in Ukraine has reshaped the modern battlefield, demonstrating that simple, cost-effective standoff weapons can achieve strategic effects when employed at scale. By converting legacy munitions into standoff weapons, Russia has created a persistent and scalable threat that imposes a severe cost imposition dilemma upon even the most advanced air defense systems. This is not an abstract concern for European allies. This is a present operational crisis being tested in real time against a real country. And what's happening in Ukraine is essentially a live-fire demonstration, one that every military planner in Moscow, Beijing, Tehran, and Pyongyang is studying with intense interest. But the story gets deeper because Russia didn't stop with the original UMPK. The weapons have evolved, and the evolution has been faster and more sophisticated than most people in Washington want to publicly acknowledge. The upgraded glide bomb kits, originally introduced in late 2023, have undergone steady development, with the first known photo of a UMPK PD-equipped Su-34 surfacing only in March 2025. The aircraft was seen carrying 4 FAB-500 M62 bombs with visibly larger wings, reinforced mounts, and a more powerful guidance mechanism, where earlier UMPK variants had a strike range of 60-80 kilometers. The UMPK PD kits now reach up to 95 kilometers, and that's just one generation of improvement. Because by October 2025, Russia had combat tested something far more significant. Major General Vadim Skibitsky, deputy head of Ukraine's Military Intelligence Directorate, said that Russia had combat-tested aviation bombs with new guidance modules that are believed to have a range of 150-200 kilometers and improved resistance to electronic warfare, noting that a recent test achieved a distance of 193 kilometers. 193 kilometers. Let that sink in. A 500-kilogram bomb that can be released from inside Russian airspace, guided by satellite navigation, increasingly resistant to electronic jamming, and it will travel nearly 200 kilometers to hit its target. That is no longer just a battlefield weapon, that is a deep strike capability. That changes what it means to have a rear area. That changes what it means to think you're safe because you're behind the front lines. As ranges extend toward and beyond 100 kilometers, glide bombs have increasingly been used against rear area targets, forcing Ukrainian forces to disperse logistics, relocate command centers, and stretch air defense coverage across wider areas, thereby diluting defensive effectiveness. What Russia is demonstrating is that with enough of these weapons, you can force an entire military to reorganize itself defensively, to spend enormous energy just surviving, energy that cannot then be spent advancing or counterattacking. That is a strategic effect, not just a tactical one. Now there's another layer to this that almost nobody in mainstream Western media is discussing, and it involves China. Because the newest iteration of these powered glide bombs, the UMPB-5R, which is the jet-propelled variant with ranges approaching 200 kilometers, doesn't just represent Russian engineering. The latest glide bomb at the front is the UMPB-5R variant. This has a small Swaiwan SW800 Pro jet engine from China. Mini-jet engines of Chinese origin are increasingly appearing in Russian standoff weapons. It is unclear how many of these engines China will be able to supply. A Chinese jet engine bolted into a Russian bomb being used to strike targets in Ukraine. That is the real axis of concern here. Not just Russia, not just China, but the quiet, practical cooperation between the two that is slowly but steadily changing the balance of power in ways that no amount of diplomatic language can paper over. When Chinese industry enables Russian military capabilities that are being actively used in a war zone, We have moved well past the point where anyone can credibly claim that China is a neutral party in this conflict. And here's what that means for America specifically. The United States has tens of thousands of troops stationed in Europe in bases that are well known, well mapped, and not particularly hardened against this kind of saturation attack. The Su-34 FAB-500 duo exemplifies Russia's adaptation to attrition warfare, prioritizing volume over precision. It has stalled Ukrainian counter-offensives and warned NATO of glide bomb vulnerabilities in peer conflicts. NATO planners are looking at what Russia is doing in Ukraine, and they are drawing conclusions, uncomfortable conclusions, about what a conflict with a major peer competitor would look like when one side can produce 120,000 guided weapons per year, and the other side is spending 2 years trying to replenish Patriot missile inventories depleted by a single regional conflict. The industrial asymmetry here is not a minor footnote, it is the central strategic fact of our time. There's also the question of what this technology represents as an export and a template. Because Russia is demonstrating, in the most public possible way, that you do not need the most advanced industrial base in the world to produce precision-guided munitions at scale. A unit costs 2 million rubles, approximately $24,160 as of 2025, which is relatively inexpensive for a guided weapon. The heavy use of civilian-grade electronics allows kits to be mass-produced cheaply, but also makes them unreliable compared to Western equivalents. Civilian-grade electronics, that's the key phrase. Russia took components that you can source from global commercial supply chains, integrated them into a weapons kit, and produced one of the most consequential standoff weapons in active use anywhere on Earth. The template for that is now documented, it will be replicated, adapted, and proliferated. Iran already builds long-range drones with civilian-grade components. North Korea is watching. Non-state actors with state backing are watching. The barrier to producing mass quantities of guided munitions just dropped dramatically, and that has implications that extend far beyond Ukraine and far beyond Europe. What about America's own capabilities in response? This is where the conversation in Washington tends to become uncomfortable and somewhat evasive. For NATO, the biggest concern with glide bombs and other inexpensive munitions is the cost imposition dilemma. Defending against this threat requires a robust, layered approach designed to disrupt enemy targeting, defeat the munition, and destroy its delivery platform. This demands investment in scalable countermeasures, including expansive camouflage, concealment and deception, advanced electronic warfare, and low-cost kinetic interceptors. The problem is that America's defense procurement system is structurally oriented toward high-end, expensive, low-quantity solutions. The F-35 is a magnificent aircraft, a Patriot battery is a genuinely impressive piece of technology, but neither was designed with the assumption that an adversary could afford to saturate your defenses with 1,260 guided weapons in a single week at a cost of roughly $20,000 each. The United States needs to be thinking very seriously about its own glide bomb equivalents, about low-cost interceptors that can engage these threats without costing $1 million per shot, and about the vulnerabilities of its own forward-based infrastructure in Europe and the Pacific to exactly this kind of attritional bombardment. Coupled with a stealth platform, these mass-produced munitions enhance Russia's deep strike capability and complicate NATO defense planning on the eastern flank. And now Russia is integrating these weapons onto its Su-57, its fifth-generation stealth fighter, which means the delivery platforms are becoming harder to detect and intercept, even as the munitions themselves are becoming cheaper, more numerous, and longer-ranged. The trajectory of that development should focus minds in the Pentagon far more than the daily headlines about diplomatic negotiations and ceasefire proposals. Because here is the fundamental reality that this entire story points toward. The war in Ukraine is not a contained regional conflict with limited lessons for American security. It is a live demonstration of what industrialized, high-volume precision warfare looks like when one side commits fully to a mass-production, cost-asymmetric approach. And the country running that demonstration is not a declining power. It is a power that, whatever its economic and demographic constraints, has shown a remarkable capacity to adapt, innovate under pressure, and produce military capability at a scale and cost that challenges Western assumptions about industrial and technological dominance. Russia's 300-kilometer glide bomb breakthrough represents a low-cost precision arsenal that challenges NATO air defenses and reshapes the global air power balance. America is not in immediate danger of being bombed by FAB-500s. That's not the point, and anyone who tells you that's the argument being made here is being deliberately obtuse. The point is strategic. The point is about what happens when the military balance in Europe shifts, when American allies face a threat they cannot independently counter, when the cost of maintaining that balance falls disproportionately on American taxpayers and American soldiers, and when the weapons being used to create that imbalance were built using Chinese engines, civilian electronics, and a production philosophy that the United States has not seriously adopted for any of its own munitions programs. The point is about what happens to the global order, to trade routes, to currency systems, to the network of alliances that has underpinned American prosperity for 8 decades, when the perception spreads that American power cannot be projected reliably, cannot sustain its commitments, and cannot match the scale of what adversaries are now producing? That is the real question this story raises, and it deserves a real answer.